You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. Can you access wisdom that you never actually learned? Find out more in part 3 of the HYPNOTIKA series. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer. What if everything we've been told about holistic health, healing, and well-being is only part of the story? Because thriving in today's world looks different than it used to. Here, we challenge the narratives, rethink what it means to become human, and explore how that shapes the way we lead, live, and step into our full potential. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to our special HYPNOTIKA series. In this third part of the HYPNOTIKA series, we journey beyond the surface of the conscious mind to explore how the brain may act as a powerful antenna for universal wisdom. We discuss the fascinating intersection of biology and spirituality, revealing how tiny structures within us might connect our individual experiences to a much larger field of consciousness. Craig Meriwether is a certified clinical hypnotherapist, medical hypnosis specialist, neuro-linguistic programming specialist, and founder of Arizona Integrative Hypnotherapy, helping people eliminate the negative emotions and limiting beliefs that may be keeping them from reaching their full potential. For over 12 years, Craig has been helping people heal from early childhood trauma, helping cancer patients with pain control, veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, students with test anxiety, children with nightmares, entrepreneurs with confidence, athletes with peak performance, and anyone who may be dealing with overwhelm, fear, and anxiety. Here is the third part of this fascinating series, Spiritual Hypnotherapy with Craig Meriwether. Hello and welcome back, everyone, to our special series, HYPNOTIKA. And today we are diving into part 3, and it's all about spiritual hypnotherapy. Now, last time we covered the healing power of hypnotherapy, and before that in part 1, we busted some myths around hypnotherapy. So tune into the first 2 parts if you haven't listened to those yet. And today, join us for an exploration into more of the spiritual side of hypnotherapy. And here today with me again is my guest, Craig Meriwether, and he will take it from here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate asking me back again, because this is a really fascinating discussion, really fascinating topic. Sort of like we've been swimming in the shallow end of the pool, talking about current life issues and how you can use the power of the subconscious mind to heal. And what we're going to do is just head over to the deep end of the pool and access of higher self. And what I find fascinating about this work is everyone's ability to do this. And we can get a bit into the maybe biology of it or what's going on in the brain. Because I know in part 4, the last part of the series, we're going to talk in a more in-depth way about past life regression. So this is setting up for that next conversation. And so a lot of this work is one I'm just fascinated by in my own life. Probably the 2 things that were really important to me growing up was dealing with my own anxiety and depression. I literally remember most kids are like wanting to be astronauts or football players or whatever they want to be, and rock stars or actors or something. And I just wanted to be happy because I felt so anxious and depressed all the time. And so that was a big focus of kind of my late teens or 20s, is looking at personal growth. Tony Robbins was big in the 90s, dating myself there. But Tony Robbins was getting huge and therefore the personal development, the self-growth movement was always out there, of course, but just something about Tony Robbins made the conversation bigger. The internet started getting out there in the late 90s. Even those SSRI drugs like Prozac and things, those came out in the late 90s. And so the conversation opened up about this. And one of the things that kept coming up in terms of creating change in your life was hypnotherapy. The other aspect of my life that was super important was spirituality. And I grew up in religion. I grew up in the Episcopal Church. I think we talked about this before, maybe the first session or so, or the first part. But Episcopal Church is Protestantism, it's Catholicism light. So I like the robes and the candles and the rituals and the ceremony of it all. It's something comforting about that, even familiar to me about that. But I also went to a Baptist-run high school, started in sixth grade, junior high and high school from sixth grade to 12th grade here in America. And so my life was just inundated with religion, Monday through Friday, of course, in school. And then my friends all went to the church. I lived right a few blocks away from the church. So my kind of community was around this church. And so my friends were at the church. So in the evenings and after school and weekends, do hang out with my church friends and do youth group stuff and all that kind of stuff. So my upbringing, basically from day one until 1920 or so, was the church. And so my life was formed around wanting to gain more spiritual insights. Because one thing that relieved the depression and the anxiety was their spiritual experiences, those mountaintop highs. And so spirituality became a focus. Some other people find relief in self-soothing in other things, whether it's smoking cigarettes or drinking or drugs or gambling or things like that. And I focused my self-soothing on spirituality because that's the only thing I really knew. Lo and behold, you never guess what hypnotherapy is also helpful in doing, and that's accessing this more spiritual side. And so as I started doing the healing work with hypnotherapy, I also found as my worldview widened, as I moved out of where I grew up and into Santa Cruz, California, which is more bohemian, hippie, melting pot, the cliche of America being the melting pot of all these different cultures and peoples. And that was certainly true of that area of California, of the world. Silicon Valley's right there with Santa Clara and Palo Alto, and San Francisco is right there, and sort of Santa Cruz is beautiful beach town. And all these cultures and different ways of thinking about life, the universe, and everything, and different ways of thinking about spirituality opened up to me. I didn't know this stuff. And so it was a huge education to me to go to the spiritual bookstore, the kind of new age bookstore. My worldview was just this little section of it. That's all I understood, and that's all I cared about. And then it slowly just started widening to eventually slow drip to accessing the entirety of the bookstore in terms of my understanding. And I guess maybe acceptance would be a better way of saying it. Now, one thing that kind of kept me from maybe using more of the plant style medicines to access these higher states was one, my upbringing, because you just didn't do drugs in a religious upbringing like I went through, and just access really back in the 90s. And so you just couldn't do ayahuasca ceremonies in Malibu and fly down to South America or Central America to find a shaman. You just couldn't do that unless you just bought a ticket and asked around. It wasn't as accessible, and it certainly was very illegal at the time, at least here in the United States. But there's this other aspect of doing this deeper work using spiritual hypnotherapy, accessing your own ability to connect in a way that's deeper than just, say, meditating or guided visualization. And we can talk a bit about, more about the biology of what's going on. That's a big part of what I write about in my book, Past Lives Guidebook, about the science of this and what's happening in terms of spiritual hypnotherapy and past life regression. And I'm certainly, when I finally take a breath, Petra, you can, if you have any questions about any of this, but it's such a fascinating conversation as we move over into the deep end. I think people understand that we all have the capability of doing this. And it's a pretty extraordinary way of accessing that part of divinity or your divinity, however you look at it that way. And just like we all have the ability to do hypnotherapy, be put into hypnosis, and not that I can make anybody go into hypnosis, just like I can't make anybody meditate. I can't make anybody focus their attention on their breath, just like I can't make anybody. It's all about your intention. If you have the intention of accessing these deeper states, you're more than have the ability to do it. I know that's not great grammar, but
thank you for sharing that. No, I love that. And I think a lot of us can relate to what you were looking for is that you found in these spiritual experiences is some type of experience and just connecting with yourself. And also that I want to say part of community that gives us a sense of belonging, right? A lot of us want to look for that and find that in our lives. We have work and we have family, and then there's a piece that we usually find that's missing from all of that. So I really can relate to your search and your discoveries and going forward from that. And yeah, I'd love to know more about the biology of some of this. I think our listeners would be very curious about that as well. Is how do we put this in a context of science when we talk about spiritual hypnotherapy?
One of the great things that's been going on the last 20 years is just the ability to do extraordinary research around the brain, around the body, and as related to spiritual experiences. And what's also, of course, fascinating is just the ability to communicate with each other over the internet, through forums, and find this research, which is pretty readily available nowadays. But a lot of this work, at least that I focus on in terms of the past life regression and spiritual hypnotherapy I do, is based on the work of Michael Newton. And a lot of your listeners probably know about Michael Newton and his books, Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls. Those were the first two, anyway. And back in 1969, as a psychotherapist, he was working with a patient of his who's dealing with anxiety and stress and hurt and pain that didn't seem to be able to resolve. And so Michael Newton, as a psychotherapist, wanted to move into regression, regress to cause, meaning going back to that original issue, the ground zero point of where this anxiety or the hurt or the pain or the trauma came from. So oftentimes, especially if it happens as a little kid, you may not remember it. You may put it behind that veil. And of course, that's, as I talked about in part 1 and part 2, that's what can be very healing about therapeutic hypnosis, is the ability to relieve and heal even things that you may not consciously remember. So what he wanted to do was take his patient back to maybe early childhood and see if there's anything that needed to be resolved in order to create the healing. Well, as they're doing this hypnosis process, moving back to a memory, mind you, not just like you're moving back in time, not like he's time traveling. Here in America, we have that movie Back to the Future. It's not like you're going back in time. You're just having a memory. Just like if I ask somebody about school, 16, what school were you going to? What was it like? Big school, small school? Who were your friends? What was the music like? What did you do? Sports? Were you an athlete? Were you a musician? Were you do theater? Were you smoking cigarettes with the cool kids? It's a memory. You're not going back to school or your earliest memory or lunch with your friend a month ago at that cool new restaurant. It's just a memory. So he's accessing, hopefully, what they want to access is this, in a safe and gentle way, the trauma so that it can get relieved. He keeps going. He goes past childhood. He goes past being a newborn, goes past being in utero, and he goes back to just being a soul in this soul state, in this spirit world, what Michael Newton finally described as life between lives. And he did his deep emotional healing work there. Now, Michael Newton was fascinated by this. He wondered if other people could access this state and do the same kind of deep healing work. This was accidental, him moving back there. So could you do it on purpose? So he started working with people and, I guess, to a certain extent, experimenting to see if other people could access this state. How could he help people get to the state? And he developed this protocol to get people back to that spirit world, that life between lives of just being 100% soul before you incarnate here on earth as a human being. And as he worked throughout the 1970s with people, he started realizing that people are having similar experiences of the soul. They didn't know each other. There's no internet, there's no texting, there's no cell phones, there's no WhatsApp. There's no way to communicate with each other. And yet these people from around the country, maybe even around the world, who he was working with from different walks of life, different age groups, are having similar experiences. These memories were pretty similar. And so he started correlating all that information. He worked with tens of thousands of people in the 1970s and the 1980s. This is 20 years, 365 days a year. Yeah, he's working with thousands upon thousands of people who are having similar experiences to each other. And that's what the first book's about, Journey of Souls. He does another decade worth of research. Now, that book came out in 1992, does another decade's worth of research, again, working with thousands of people over the next 10 years, and releases of kind of volume 2 of that Destiny of Souls, twice as big as the first book, with even more information about what it is to be a soul. And again, this isn't he's channeling this, he's not a medium, he's not a psychic. He's asking questions of people. And he gets enough of the same response that then he puts that in the book. And one aspect of his work is that we're coming back to this school like Earth environment to learn and to grow as a soul. And this is something we'll get in a little bit deeper in part 4, past life regression. But if you can see Earth as a training ground, as a soul, maybe to learn compassion or love or empathy or how to move through different kind of relationships in terms of love and compassion and empathy, again and again, to grow and to learn and to develop as soul. So we start off as little kids in school and learning 2 + 2 = 4 and doing finger painting. And then we go into getting our master's degree and our PhDs at university. Like we're doing that with these various topics, big, huge topics, and we grow and develop as souls. Well, what he found with this work of life between lives and also past life regression is we can access knowledge and wisdom and understanding about why we're here and how to help move forward and create healing if need be. And a little bit deeper in the past life regression in part 4. But in terms of being able to do this, we all can do this. What a lot of people have been focused on over the last 12, 15, 20 years is a part of the brain called the pineal gland. And many people have probably heard about that. There's a lot of books have been written about it, but it's this part of the brain right here. It's about the size of a grain of rice. Now, if you're doing just the audio, basically, I'm pulling up a picture, a side view of the brain. If you could imagine maybe like a golf ball in the middle of your brain, the pineal gland is about the size of a pea, size of a grain of rice. It's at the back of the golf ball, if that makes any sense. Now, this research study came out, and I don't know if that comes up backwards or not. It looks like it's backwards, but I'll read it out. And it's the title of this paper is New Crystal in the Pineal Gland, Characterization and Potential Role in Electromechanotransduction. That's a bunch of fancy words. Well, what it's saying is they've discovered in this research that came out in 2002, submitted on 2014, that there are these crystals in the pineal gland. Now, they're tiny little crystals. The pineal gland, this right-sized piece of your brain, if you're middle age, if you're around 40 years old or so, you have 40 to 45,000 of these tiny little crystals in this right-sized piece of your brain. A newborn has about 10,000. Somebody a bit older, maybe in their 70s or 80s, has 65,000. These tiny little crystals are housed within this tiny little piece of the brain. And the brain only weighs about 3 pounds. It's only about 2% of your body mass. It's not a huge organ in terms of your overall body. Now, the pineal gland's main job is melatonin production. Melatonin is a hormone that puts you to sleep. So as the sun starts to go down, melatonin production increases, cortisol levels go down, and you fall asleep. Then as the sun rises, melatonin starts to shut off, and cortisol levels rise, and you wake up. At least that's the way it's supposed to happen, but now we have screens and blue light and all that stuff, and it's messing it all up. But that's what's supposed to happen naturally within the brain. These crystals have nothing to do with melatonin production. These crystals, there's no evolutionary need for these crystals in the brain. And so what researchers have theorized, and that's what that paper was about, potential electromechanotransduction, is that because these crystals can create electromagnetic field, that's why crystals can be powerful. They conduct electricity. That's why they're in our watches and our computers and our electronics. Remember back in the day, we had our quartz crystal watches. Back in the 70s and 80s, quartz watches. It's because when mechanical pressure is applied, it creates a little electrical charge, electromagnetic field. Well, when mechanical pressure is applied to these crystals within your brain, the electromagnetic field is formed within the brain. If any fans out there of Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about this in his book, Becoming Supernatural, Joe Dispenza talks about this. That breathing technique that Joe Dispenza does when you're doing the meditations, or if you've been able to go to one of his workshops or seen him on YouTube videos, pulling it in from your perineum, from basically your root chakra, up your spinal cord into your brain. That's to circulate the energy, circulate the cerebral fluid. So you apply pressure to the pineal gland. That's what that whole breathing technique is about. So you can create that electromagnetic field. Again, what this paper is saying is when you do that, you're creating a transducer effect in your brain. Now, back in the day, people of a certain age will remember your television sets, and we can only watch our TV show at a certain time on a certain day. And let's say a famous TV show, at least here in America, was Cheers. And Cheers was on, I don't know, Thursday at 9 o'clock at night. And so Thursday at 9 o'clock at night, I'd turn my TV on and I'd turn it to the right channel. At the same time, around the same time, a big TV studio in Los Angeles had this big cassette and it put it in its equipment. And that was that week's episode. And their equipment would pull the image and sound off that magnetic tape, turn it into a frequency in their transducer and shoot it into the airwaves through the radar dish. Now, wherever you are in the world, at least back then, now it's a little bit different, but back in the day, you had all these television signals, all these radio signals. And still to this day, most cars, newer cars, of course, don't have a radio like we did back in the day where you just turn it on and you had to turn the knob to find the right station. That's because like in a big city, in a London and a Tokyo and a Paris and in New York, you may have 50, if not 60, 70 radio stations, talk radio, sports, all sorts of music, classical, hip hop, rock, jazz, whatever, country. You have all sorts of radio stations. Now, when you turn your radio on, you don't get all 50 radio stations as noise and static. You turn your radio dial to the right frequency. Your antenna on your car pulls in that one radio station. We do that with our TVs. Of course, there's not only radio signals all over the place, there's TV station signals all over the place. Now we have Wi-Fi and microwaves and all sorts of stuff. But back in the day, I had my TV with my little rabbit ears or my big antenna on my house and turn on my TV at Thursday, 9 o'clock, turn it to the right channel, turn it to channel 10, because I want to watch Cheers. And these antennas on my TV start microscopically, not to the naked eye, vibrating to the same frequency. And it pulls in just that one frequency. I have a transducer in my TV, which then turns that frequency back into image and sound, and I watch my TV show. That's what this paper is suggesting the pineal gland is doing. It's pulling in information. And there's another discussion at some point where this information is held. But in the gigantic library, Akashic Records, zero-point field, we're pulling in this information, meaning that consciousness and memory is not held within this brain. It's not locked in imprisoned in the skull. This is what this research paper says. Again, this might show up backwards on the screen, I think, but what it says, this is from Frontiers in Psychology from January 2020, Common Basis of Memory and Consciousness Understanding the Brain as a right read head interacting with an omnipresent background field. That's a lot of language right there. But what's that stating is that memory and consciousness is not held within the brain, but the brain is an antenna and is pulling in and transmitting information to and from, maybe, again, zero-point field, and that's what that was saying, the omnipresent background field. That's what's called the field, zero-point field, the force, if you're a Star Wars fan. This information comes not just from these newer research studies, but from the U.S. government's research in remote viewing back in the 1970s. And this is where this conversation takes a more conspiratorial tone. But the remote viewing research the U.S. government was doing in the 1970s, 80s, and probably is still doing, this is based on the understanding that consciousness is non-local. Meaning, again, consciousness is not imprisoned within this brain, therefore it can move about. And there was a researcher at Stanford University, and this is the short version of the story. The longer version in my book, A Past Lives Guidebook, and of course, many books out there at this point about the remote viewing research done by the U.S. government. But basically, the CIA back in the late 60s found out that the Soviet Union during the Cold War was researching ESP and psychics. They wanted to weaponize psychic ability, because how awesome would it be to stare into the Pentagon and look at war plans or the Oval Office desk or any sort of world leader, see troop movements and all sorts of things. what an extraordinary ability to gain the upper hand if you had psychics who could tell you extraordinary information like that. So the U.S. government wanted in on that too. They couldn't find anybody who took them seriously, but there was a researcher at Stanford back in the early 70s whose kind of hobby it was to debunk psychics. That's what he just liked to do in his free time. And so psychics would come to him and just say, okay, you can't prove me wrong. And they need to prove him wrong. But this one guy, he couldn't do it. And he wrote a little paper about it. He had him stare into this piece of equipment that was buried in concrete underneath this laboratory that only a couple of people really knew about. It wasn't a big, huge secret. It was just like, this is what the research was, and this is what this group was doing. They buried this piece of equipment that needed to be underground and to cool it or something, and buried in concrete. So they wanted him to stare into this equipment and tell him what the equipment did. And the guy goes, that's not really psychic ability, but let me see if I can do this. And he told him what the equipment was doing. And then he had him manipulate the information coming out of the equipment, stop the information, make it go slower, make it go faster. And he started doing that. And this guy couldn't figure out how he was doing it. It wasn't really psychic ability. It wasn't really ESP. So he decided to call it remote viewing because he put his consciousness underground to look at this machinery. So he called it remote viewing, wrote a little paper about it because he wanted a couple of his friends to understand, what is this all about? What do you think this is about? 2 weeks later, CIA shows up. Somehow they got hold of the paper. And that's where basically this remote viewing work started with the U.S. government. Basically, what they were able to prove over at least 20 years, due to the Freedom of Information Act here in the United States, we're allowed to access top secret records if the government deems it okay. And for whatever reason, they said, yeah, let's release all the information about remote viewing project we've been doing for 20 years. Got really embarrassing. And so, because they're spending millions of dollars on this weird research of psychic ability. And so they claim to have shut it down. I'm guessing they spent millions of dollars, 25 years of their time, that they were getting great results. But what a lot of the research, again, there's lots of books about it now, a huge, big chapter about it in my book, Past Lives Guidebook, that talks about consciousness being non-local. You can move it across location, even into looking into underground bunkers. And what they also found is you can move it forward and backwards in time. And what's fascinating, again, these are like double-blind studies. These are academics doing this research. And so they were creating research and experiments, double-blind tests that showed you can move forward and backwards in time with your consciousness. With consciousness being non-local, with this brain being more of an antenna, you have to start saying, what are the possibilities? If we have, with this antenna-like brain, the ability to see across time and across space. Because there was even one remote viewing experiment where the Viking satellites were going to go past Jupiter. And this is early 1970s. We didn't know much about the planets, but we were going to get footage of the planets. It was going to go by Jupiter in about 6 months. And they said, hey, remote view Jupiter. Let's see if that's even a possibility. Let's see if that's a thing. If consciousness is not local, where can it end? Is there a tether? One of the remote viewers remote viewed Jupiter. And he was talking about this planet. He's talking about the rings around it and all this stuff. And by the time he is done, everybody's, oh, he's remote viewing Saturn with the rings. And it was very similar to how Saturn is. We knew about Saturn. 6 months later, when the Viking satellites went by Jupiter, they saw the rings of Jupiter. And everything the guy said about Jupiter was correct. He hadn't remote viewed Saturn. He'd actually remote viewed Jupiter and told things about Jupiter nobody knew until 6 months later, the satellite images started coming back. What are the possibilities of this? And when you see this kind of research, you start understanding more about the biology of the brain. And you say, okay, maybe accessing memories of soul life, just like you access memories of being back in school or that vacation you took a couple of years ago or your earliest memory. If that's not held within the brain, you're accessing that from somewhere else. What are the possibilities? And another, what's fascinating about this is that quote by William James, who's one of the pioneers of modern day psychotherapy. And he had this great quote that said, to prove that all crows are not black, you only need one white crow. And after one, this is, again, I keep talking about my book, but the reason I wrote my book is because I was skeptical about this. And I was like, while I enjoy learning about and even working with people with past life regression, how does this work? How is this possible? And I started compiling and putting together the puzzle pieces of all this research, of all this science. What's the history of this? And started going all the way back to Neanderthal burial sites. That's where we started in the book, 50,000 years ago. And is there any evidence that they had some sort of understanding of life after death due to the way they buried their community or their tribe or their family? And so in the book, we go through all sorts of different cultures and time periods about their understanding of reincarnation, of past lives, of spirituality, and being able to access it. And now, as we understand more and more about the brain in just the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we understand, oh, this actually might be possible, not just hopeful or just not a symbolic creation of the subconscious mind to find healing or insights about life in a symbolic and metaphoric way, but this may actually be memories that people are able to access when they move into a more deeper trance state. And what's fascinating about this is also the research that's been coming out about sudden savant syndrome. And people may have heard about these stories of people who suffer a traumatic brain injury and wake up maybe out of a coma, just maybe wake up from unconsciousness, and they have a skill they didn't have before. You've heard about this. This is a real thing. Now, it's rare, super duper rare. But there was a kid who got hit in the head with a baseball here in America. When he woke up, because he got knocked unconscious, when he woke up, he could speak Spanish fluently. Never been able to do that before. There was a guy who dove into a swimming pool or a very shallow pool, like one of those pools that's only 3 feet deep, and they tell you don't dive into the pool. This is why you don't dive into a shallow pool. He bonked his head at the bottom, knocked himself unconscious, but when he woke up, he had a virtuosic skill at playing the piano. Never played it before, didn't understand music, but now he could read, write music, and play the piano at an expert level. There's other people, again, like this. Now, of course, don't go driving your car into a wall so you can learn Spanish or whatever. Don't be doing that stuff because you want to get better at the piano or martial arts or something. Because it's rare that actually happens. But again, to prove that all crows are not black, you only need one white crow. And it makes absolutely no sense in terms of how the brain operates, at least the way we used to think about it, that could even happen. And so we used to think that you practice something, whether it's a musical instrument or dance or martial arts or learning to walk as a child or whatever it is. We used to think you did that to build what they called muscle memory. Well, we know that muscles don't have memory, but it was just a way of describing how the brain created these neural pathways, these brain cells connecting together. So when you walk down the street, when you ride a bicycle, when you do dance or martial arts, you're firing brain cells. You think a thought, you feel an emotion, you're firing all these brain cells. A pattern starts to form. If you do it over and over again, that pattern connects. So you form this neural pathway, this algorithm of brain cells connecting together. There's neurons that fire together, wire together. If you've heard that expression, brain cells that fire at the same time will all connect together for efficient, faster communication. So a habit forms and you get better at that thing, whatever it is, at walking as a child, or martial arts or dance, or feeling fear or anxiety or joy or happiness. You can get better at it because you're building, quote unquote, muscle memory. These sudden savant experiences people have had make can't be true then. So it seems like what could possibly be happening as you create these stronger, faster, more powerful neural pathways for that thing, whether it's martial arts or dance or the piano or whatever, you're not creating the habit of it or the skill of it in the brain. You're making the antenna bigger and more powerful to pull in that information. And these people who get bonked on the head, it just wakes up that certain pattern in a way. And now you're just pulling in that information. That's the only way that can really make sense. It's like you're driving down the road in your car and you hit a pothole and the radio just moves, to a different radio station and is now pulling in different information. This is like when we practice something like the piano or the guitar or dance or martial arts or walking as a kid, We're not developing the skill within the brain. We're building an antenna to pull in that skill in a faster, more efficient, stronger, more empowering way the more you practice it. Because that's the only way that makes sense. And to prove that all crows are not black, you only need one white crow. And same with the experiences of all these tens of thousands of people that Michael Newton worked with just in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, let alone that Michael Newton, this dude, is still doing research and putting out books. He put out a book a couple of years ago. So after a while, how many white crows do you need in terms of understanding that we have the ability to access this information? Now, there's still a lot of debate and a lot of talk about how it happens. Is the pineal gland really there as the antenna? Does memory really reside outside of the brain, like in the Akashic records or a big, huge library of your lives and information about being a soul? Or is it something else? We have this reality as a computer simulation. We have theories about it being the holographic universe. And if you know about a hologram, every particle aspect of that hologram contains the entirety of the hologram. We had those little bookmarks as kids. I don't know, maybe that was the 1970s things, but you had these 3D bookmarks, and it was like a dolphin jumping out of the water. And if you turned it the right way, the dolphin would jump out of the water. That was like a hologram. If it was a real hologram, if you cut that bookmark in half, you now have two images of dolphins jumping out of the water, the same exact image. It's just now smaller. If you cut that bookmark into 100 pieces, you now have 100 little tiny dolphins jumping out of the water, because the entirety of the hologram contains all of the information. So if this universe is a holographic universe, then wouldn't we contain all the information of the universe? That's one theory behind it. There's also the multiverse and all these different theories that people way smarter than me are debating. They still haven't come to any sort of conclusion. Again, write about that in the book as well, just going through these different theories and how they can all relate to accessing this information about being spirits, about being souls, why we're here to learn. And so it really comes down to, again, your intention and why you want to use this work. And it could be just for fun and curiosity. It could be wanting to see if you connect with some of the people in your lives. Are they part of your soul group or soul family? Because that's one of the things that came out of the Michael Newton books, Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls. We seem to be put in this group. Sort of like you start school at 5 years old with this group of kids, and you just go all the way up together to getting your master's degree, your PhD together, maybe with the same teacher. That's what happens. We become souls. We get born as souls, if you will. That's a good way of saying it. And then we get placed in this group of young souls, and we're all going to learn and grow together. We're going to play roles in each other's lives, like we're a theater troupe. And we come down to earth to play different roles in different parts in different time periods. And then when that's done and Act 3 is over, we take a break, and then we come back and we play an entirely different role in a different play, learning different things and new things. We're still the same actor, same soul. We're just maybe playing a different part. And do you recognize anybody in your life today or from maybe past lives? It's quite... and we may have more questions at this point than answers. This could be a 10-hour conversation and still not really understand it all. Because again, there's people way smarter than me, extraordinarily intelligent people arguing about this stuff, whether it's a computer simulation, whether it's the multiverse, where there's string theory and there's 27 different dimensions or whatever that's all about, or it's the holographic universe. They haven't even settled on that stuff yet, finding the unifying theory of everything, as Stephen Hawking was trying to find, and everybody was trying to find Einstein and all of them. And they still haven't found it yet. With all the extraordinary brain power and now computer power, we still haven't come up with the unifying theory or how this reality of ours works. But there's been enough, maybe peering behind the curtain over the last maybe 50, 60 years between remote viewing and the Michael Newton research and all the other stuff that's come out in the Brian Weiss books. Again, I focus on them because these are scientists doing it. As someone who has a specific gift or skill in terms of maybe being a psychic or a medium or channeling, these are people doing research here on Earth that seems to be pointing in a certain direction. And when you get all this brain power pointing in a certain direction. Maybe they don't have everything totally figured out yet, but certainly there's enough evidence out there to show that consciousness is non-local. Certainly there's enough information about what about sudden savant syndrome that kind of makes how we learn, how we access information different than when maybe we were taught at school. And so you start putting all these puzzle pieces together, and it seems like maybe through the pineal gland and this brain being an antenna, we have the ability to access this information.
Yeah. I love this discussion. You're taking us very much into the science part of it, which I love as well. And for our listeners to dive into that a little bit more too. It's a big rabbit hole, I want to say, of that we can jump into and take this in all sorts of directions. But I find this fascinating that with all of this information that we're learning now and that's available already, has been for many decades, and some of us have never heard of it before, that we can start exploring this now and explore it from a spiritual perspective and also from our own healing perspective and finding ourselves, in a sense, in all of that, right? Finding where do we fit into this. A big part of the suffering and that I see in many clients and a lot of friends, colleagues, family members is that they've lost that alignment. What are we doing here? What's my purpose? Where do I fit in this big world of all of the stuff that we are learning now and becoming aware of? Yeah, I feel that this is just absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I think a little part of coming back to ourselves and seeing and finding out where we are in all of this. Probably through hypnotherapy. We can explore a lot of that.
Again, fascinating about this work. I appreciate everything you just said, because I think you're right on. You hit the head of the nail right on the head, is that we strive for more information about who we are, especially as this world just gets more complicated, more chaotic. How do we settle and understand what possibly could be going on at a deeper level? And what's, again, fascinating about this work is it's not somebody's reading this information to you like a psychic or a tarot card reader or something. That's fun and amazing and can be very insightful and very helpful to have somebody give you that information. But this is you experiencing it yourself. This is you swimming in the pool and then going over to the deep end and in a safe and gentle way accessing this information. What somebody like myself, as the guide or the facilitator, the lifeguard, if you will, is there to help and facilitate. And because one aspect of this work of going up into that soul state and that soul world, it's very comfortable. It's very warm and friendly. And there's a lot of sensations and experiences maybe you're not familiar with being up there. And sometimes it's nice just to sit in the hot tub and just be in that warm wonderfulness. Sometimes you're there for a specific reason. You want to gain information. You want to create healing. And that's an extraordinary place to create healing, to reset, to recharge your soul energy, as well as gain information more about what you're just talking about purpose, about your ultimate goals, about your mission. Sometimes you don't want to get out of the hot tub. You just want to sit in that warm bathtub of hot water and just, it's cozy here. Okay, we'll give you a few more minutes in the hot tub, but we need to get going and move on to the healing place and then move on to maybe the library or to gain more information or the current life viewing room, as Michael Newton talks about it, and understand more about purpose. And so there's where a guide is, because it's nice to be in the hot tub. And so you get into that state, let's just sit and have a wonderful time, which is nice. And of course you can do that. But in terms of wanting to gain this information, I'll have people email me questions or people they want to find out more about. And let's find out about these questions you wanted answers to. And that's what's helpful about having somebody guide you through this, as well as to, not that they're doing it for you. It's just, okay, now it's time to move on to, because you lose the sense of time when you're doing hypnotherapy in an hour-long session, a 3-hour-long session. When we're doing some of this deeper spiritual work, can be up to 3.5 hours. Seems like 10 minutes. And so you lose that sense of time. And what's nice about having somebody guide and facilitate and lifeguard the situation is if something comes up that needs resolution or healing around, there's somebody there to help guide you through it. But also just, it's time to get out of the hot tub and move forward with these questions you wanted answers to. And it's really exciting work. And it's an adjunct or maybe or just a way of doing this work without accessing it through plant medicine. Maybe it's a little more controlled situation when you're working with somebody doing this work, as opposed to maybe the more plant medicine side of it, and you can work it together, not at the same time, but you'd be doing some of this and doing some of that, and all sorts of different pathways to understanding. So this is one that resonates with me and the way I need to move through this world, and it's extraordinarily fascinating. And like I said, my book is entirely written out of my curiosity and skepticism about how it all works. I want to dive in deeper as to how this possibly makes any sense.
Yeah.
And prove to myself that it's not just symbolism and metaphor created by the subconscious mind, but these are real experiences.
Yeah. Do you find it empowering when you think about it that if we assume that consciousness is non-local, that would also mean that technically we have access to all the answers that we were looking for and all of the pieces of our healing already, because it's non-local, it's out there. So do you find there's something very empowering about that kind of perspective, that suddenly we're not victims anymore, what's happened to us, or we're not stuck in this one, I want to say, situation or reality, but really, if consciousness is non-local, we are connected to everything and can access everything in that sense, whether we remember it or not. That's a different question, but there's something quite empowering about that.
Yeah. And I think to a certain extent, these brains of ours prevent the overwhelm. Again, just like turning on your radio and hearing 50 radio stations at once. That's not helpful. If you want to hear some talk radio, you want to hear a discussion of the local political thing that's going on in your town, or sports, what's going on with the big game, or just want some music. If you turn on your radio and you're pulling in 50 radio stations, that's going to be a lot of noise. And so I think this brain of ours, part of it, by closing the curtain on every past life and all that information of the universe that we have access to, like just all of a sudden dumping every book in the library into your brain, like downloading it. Oh, how do you organize all that? And so I think to a certain extent, because we're here to learn and to grow, we need to quiet some of that down and focus on the play at hand, if you will. So if like you're in this theater troupe and you're doing Death of the Salesman, or I don't know, you're a good man, Charlie Brown, or whatever, Cats or Phantom of the Opera or something, you're just focus on this play to get from the first act to the second act to the third act, and understand the motivation of these characters and what the author is trying to present with this play. You don't need every single play, from Greek tragedies to all of Shakespeare to all the other authors that have ever written a play throughout time, clogging your head. You need to just focus on the play at hand that you're involved in, because everything else just gets chaotic and overwhelming. And so I think to a certain extent, that's what's happening here. While we do have the ability, like you just said, the ability to access the information, but yeah, maybe one book at a time. It's just back in the day, a lot of people of a certain age will remember the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that was our internet back in the 1970s and 80s. This 34-volume set of books from A to Z, from aardvarks to zebras. And that was all the information we knew. But if all those books fell on the floor and started the pages going, it's, oh, this is chaotic. I don't know what I'm looking at here. But if you pull one book out and you look at polar bears, now you understand polar bears. And so I think we have the ability to do that, because otherwise it just get too overwhelming. And so to a certain extent, we're pulling in this 5D digital information through this 3D analog brain. And so there has to be some accommodation, some processing, and some translation to that. If people are familiar with the Christopher Nolan movie Interstellar, Matthew McConaughey and Hathaway, it's an older movie. Earth is dying and they have to go out into space to find a new planet is the basic premise of it. It's a great movie. One of my favorites. And I've seen it a handful of times already. And one aspect, I'm not giving anything away, I don't think. And if you haven't seen it, it's a 15-year-old movie. It's not like you're going to go out and see it tonight. But one aspect of this at the end is one of the people are trapped in the 5D world. This would make sense if you saw the movie. But they're trapped in the 5D world and they're trying to communicate to the 3D world. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. That's why the books from the bookshelf on the floor, or the dust in the light, or the Morse code on the watch. He can't just communicate through text or through fax or through WhatsApp or through an email or just by shouting or getting a can with a string. and talking to somebody from the 5D world to the 3D world. He has to find these other ways of trying to communicate, which may take some processing and some figuring out and translating in that 3D analog world. And so as we pull this information, it may even take some time, even the information people are getting in a session, even if it's a longer session, like a 3.5 hour session, the processing and the translating, the accommodating of this information continues for the days, weeks, and even months ahead. And it just doesn't end because the session's over and the Zoom call's over. And when I do most of this work over Zoom, believe it or not, it's an extraordinary way of doing it, just like this. Just talking to somebody across the world. And because you're doing the work, I'm just here to guide. What an extraordinary way of doing this work, being comfortable in your own home, feeling safe and relaxed. So but the kind of information you're processing just doesn't end because the session's over. And what they say about in Buddhism about enlightenment, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. You still got the chores of life and the challenges of life. But as he's still kind of processing this information in the days and weeks ahead, you can maybe find a more resourceful, resilient way of moving through life because this information, you've opened up this pathway as you understand more and more about it and get more information from other books and podcasts and videos and documentaries and all sorts of things. The understanding of what you experience becomes even greater.
Yeah. Wow. That is so powerful. And thank you for sharing that with us today and taking us on this journey. I feel like we just got a little bit more insight and wisdom from your perspective. And certainly for listeners, I think this is a very interesting piece to explore in their own journeys of searching for themselves, searching for their own healing. So yeah, thank you for spending this time. And I just want to make a little note for our listeners that if you pop over to the show notes, so wherever you're listening to this, be this on Apple or Spotify, wherever you're listening in, pop over to our website of the podcast and look at the show notes for the images that Craig was holding up during the episode, because you of course can't see them in the audio part. So we'll put those in the show notes so that you can see the different things he was referring to. And also we'll link to the papers he was referring to. So you have all of that information for your own curiosity. You can look those up and read through them. And of course, reach out to us if you have any questions, or if you want to ask Craig something, reach out to us and connect with us. And yeah, thank you, Craig, for spending this time with me. And we'll wrap up part 3 of spiritual hypnotherapy here in our 4-part Hypnotica series today. And join us next time. We will be diving into past life regression, another amazing topic that personally I find so curious. And I can't wait to actually hear Craig's take on that. Thank you so much for being here today. Truly appreciate it, Craig.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting this on. I know these are some extraordinarily deep conversations, so I appreciate you giving the time to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to have more of these conversations and just explore different things that we're all curious about. Absolutely. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today. Thanks for listening to our series. And we will be back with part 4 next week. And everyone, take care and be well. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejōrni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.